Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, April the 2nd. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy of Politico. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the briefing podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. And we have a bit of a humble brag to get going with this morning, don't we, Sam? We're delighted to hear we have so many listeners who are MPs. A new survey about where our esteemed lawmakers get their news in the morning suggests we are the top podcast on the list. We are both very happy about that. On with the day, we'll come to the government's big growth announcement in just a moment. There's a press conference by Kim Leadbeater about the later stages of the assisted dying bill. But there is only one big story. And yes, Sam, it is...
Well, we do, and we don't know what the biggest story, not just in Britain, but in the world is in just a few hours. It's called Liberation Day, the day that Donald Trump slaps tariffs on American imports. We think that's coming at 9 o'clock UK time tonight. It's the moment that he hopes he can say that he is going to make America wealthy again. It's a celebration in Donald Trump world. And the truth is, absolutely nobody knows exactly what's going to happen when he stands up in the Rose Garden to an invited audience of his cabinet and politicians. Nobody knows what's going to happen to British exports, to the global economy. All we know is that he will talk about tariffs. He will probably talk about imposing tariffs for everyone, possibly as high as 20%, but whether or not it's a global flat level or whether some countries are punished more than others. Well, they all seem to be huddled in the Oval Office last night. That's according to my colleague Mark Stone, who I was talking to on the Trump 100 podcast last night. But really, where those discussions ended up, we're not going to know for a few hours. But here's a good fact for you, Anne. The price of gold yesterday reached a record high. Gold, of course, is what investors buy when everyone else and everything else, stocks, shares and bonds, feels just too risky, which it does at the moment a bit. So that peaking isn't the greatest sign for what's going on in the economy all around the world.
Yes, the resort to gold, the Spandau Ballet response to any global turbulence. Gold is where it's at. Well, look, the message in response, apart from maybe rushing out to buy some gold, the message from Downing Street has been pretty much the same for days, hasn't it? Which is to stay cool and calm. We keep hearing those words. The news strong and stable and reacting in the national interest, but not rushing into responses. The way I read that, be interesting how you see it, Sam, is I think there's a lot of sort of psychological handling of MPs to say, like, don't get yourselves all worked up about the noise and the response that Donald Trump is likely to produce when these tariffs go on, and they are likely to be pretty humongous. Let's keep negotiating with the US, whatever happens tonight, but no noises off, please. And one thing that we have learned along the way, just talking to my Politico colleagues in DC following this, is that we have got confirmation that the tariffs will be implemented immediately. So there's not even thinking time for Keir Starmer, for anyone else who's going to have to give response to kind of take in how the UK is going to be hit, other than to have prepared. They will need to respond quickly, knowing that the tariffs are going to hit straight away.
I do always enjoy being told, Anne, that the government is responding in the national interest. It just so turns out that the national interest is whatever the government chooses to do in retrospect. But looking poised and calm, I think is quite important at this moment, because the story that the UK government has been trying to tell has been, if we're being honest, sliding all around the place. When you kind of pull the camera back and look at a 1 week, 1 month, 3 month time horizon, we're kind of 70 odd days into Donald Trump land. I remember when Donald Trump stood up at the press conference with Keir Starmer, and quite clearly Donald Trump said that Keir Starmer at that point had been negotiating on tariffs. Quite clearly, Peter Mandelson and the team in the US Embassy have had detailed conversations. Johnny Reynolds out last week. I remember last week when we were talking about whether or not some kind of mini trade deal or agreement could be struck to in some way help the UK avoid tariffs. it was played down but not ruled out, the chances of a deal being struck last week. It seems that Trump himself hasn't been ready to strike what appears to be a nearly done deal with the UK because he wants his moment in the Rose Garden. So Downing Street is trying to protect confidence about its strategy and its approach. But as you say, I think that's a lot about the political handling about it, because the noises out of government are different right now just to what they were when we were talking about this 7 days ago.
Indeed. And the strong impression that we get from inside the DC bubble is that a lot of people very close to Trump don't really know exactly what he's going to say. It is that unpredictability about the president that makes dealing with this even harder than it would be if you, broadly speaking, knew what was coming down the line and you could line up your defences and get your ducks in a row. Several options on the table as far as we understand it. Fox News saying last night that Trump's still considering a flat 20% global tariff. You could see the appeal of that from his point of view. It would be simple. He wants to have a blunderbuss and he wants a moment that sort of says this goes for everyone. He would go that way. But Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and others do seem to be pushing him towards a more targeted option, higher tariffs for the worst offending countries with a trade surplus with the US in their eyes. Well, that would be good for us because it wouldn't include Britain. And then you could have some form of a cap, but we don't know how that cap would be set. And the other option really is that Donald Trump simply says, look, here it is, take it, well, you can't take it or leave it, you have to take it if tariffs are imposed, but then leaves the door open to countries, if you like, coming as petitioners and trying to negotiate their way out. And that is, I think, in the background, that's what the British government kind of hopes would be the case, because we're not in such bad odour with Donald Trump and the administration as other European countries, so we might get to the front of the queue. But basically, you're negotiating for less pain rather than any gain.
What I want to ask you, Anne, is just before we get onto how the UK might respond, do you think, looking at everything in the way that the Trump White House and Washington is acting at the moment that we're having at this point is more about economics, or is it more about diplomacy? It just strikes me, as you look across the British response, the European response, Asian countries responding, countries genuflecting. They're going down on bended knee to do things to basically please Donald Trump, the giant atop global diplomacy at the moment. Do you think at its heart Donald Trump's aim is to have that impression of, one-time critics, friends and foe, all bending to his will? Or is this about the American economy? It strikes me that the manner in which all of this is being done, to have a great big razzmatazz in the Rose Garden at 9 p.m. UK time, watched all around the world, and then to have everybody queuing up to sign bespoke deals to try and escape some of the tariffs that they've all been slapped with, is just as much about creating a power moment as it's got anything to do with the economy, not least because most conventional economics would suggest that domestically in the US and globally, the economies of pretty much everywhere are going to be hurt by what's about to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight into the way that Donald Trump ticks. Is partly he doesn't agree with conventional economics. He's made that clear when he said repeatedly in the election campaign that tariffs was the most beautiful word in the English language. There are not many economists who would back that up, other than if you really believe that you can bring all of this production to the US and that the US then undergoes some sort of huge boom as a result of it. But that seems a bit dubious too. It is possible that he has simply convinced himself that he can rewrite the laws of economics, because he has, I can see I was laughing, but he has rewritten the laws of politics. That's the way I'm sort of channeling in a Trump here. I think this is probably the way that he thinks that a lot of people are wrong, in the way that he thinks a lot of people have been wrong about the appeal of MAGA, and that also aspects of that Trump agenda have spread into politics across the world and into Europe. So as far as he's concerned, he keeps winning, right? So that may hit the wall of reality, but I think what you put your finger on really well is that for Donald Trump, and it is that televisual, well, in the days when, Donald Trump rose, it was only television, but if you like, the character made for video, made for television, made for those social media clips, it's always about the power moment. And of course, yes, to have all of these leaders that he can call silly names if he wants to, or if he also feels generous, extend a hand that they can imperiously come and beg for relief from tariffs imposed by the US. I think that is a power move that he'll be greatly enjoying.
Just an important note. I absolutely wasn't laughing because I disagreed with you. I was laughing because actually that rings completely right, and rewriting the rules of economics, but also rewriting the rules of political communication. Look, this is a guy, whatever you think of his politics, who has an ability to grab the microphone and love the TV camera and dominate new forms of political communication and new forms of communication like nothing we've ever seen. He's sort of forged in the heat of WWF wrestling, which he played a role in the 80s, where he understands different forms of character that you need to play in order to attract attention, and plays these different roles. There is an element, there's a thing in WWF, there's a rule, which is you must never, ever, ever show your real self. And sometimes I remember that when looking at Donald Trump, you see this person who at points is delivering lines like he's on The Apprentice, at points is just trying to crush all around him, but never lets the camera leave him. And it is a technique that absolutely undeniably works. And as I saw Kemi Badenoch stand in front of what looked like a bedsheet yesterday to give a press conference, I did wonder whether there are one or two lessons. We ought to just talk about the UK response to all of this. Now, of course, they don't know what's coming, but there is this sort of curious optimism. No, let me put that differently. They say that there is an optimism about their approach in Downing Street. That the sort of corrective to that is they had a different approach last week that didn't work, and now they're saying they're confident about their approach. But we think that the deal between the UK and the US is pretty much done. It's just a question of when Donald Trump sort of agrees to it, and he's decided not to up until now because he wants this big moment. We are worried about a number of things. We are worried, the UK is worried that if these tariffs get slapped on, which they will do later, the people who make goods that are exported to the US, the £60 billion of goods that are exported to the US, their jobs could be at risk. They are in industries like cars and chemicals. They're worried about the market for sectors that are particularly hit by tariffs being flooded by cheap imports for goods that otherwise would have gone to the US. So that's why we're trying to do a carve out for ourselves, but also there's just the impact of what happens with the rest of the world too. In return, we sort of know the outlines, we've talked about it for days, of what we're offering. We are offering to basically give tax concessions to great big tech giants. That's to in some way water down the digital services tax, although I'm told by Downing Street that a deal isn't done on that quite yet, but it seems like it's nearly there. The UK will also lower agricultural tariffs for agricultural stuff coming from the US to the UK, which will no doubt anger farmers yet more, although none of that will involve lowering UK food standards below what they are at the moment, which would of course cause problems with Europe and with Northern Ireland. But what we won't do is retaliate with tariffs immediately. Interestingly, today, the EU isn't going to retaliate immediately either. They're going to look at the package and ask for more time. But there is just a stop and pause moment to see how to react. But let's see. There will be a race. In the end, there'll be a league table of countries that manage to do deals that get you out of whatever is slapped on us tonight. And the question is the softly approach of Keir Starmer likely to put us at the top of that league table, strike the quickest deal, or do leaders who have a more hardball approach end up leapfrogging the UK, and we end up in pain for longer because we didn't push hard enough?
I'd also add to that, see it through the prism of comparative pain, and we do tend to compare ourselves with continental Europe to that extent. The shadow of Brexit, Britain is still hanging over all of this, isn't it, in terms of the perception? And if we do get away more lightly than our colleagues in the EU, I think that will be seen in some ways as a vindication, Sam, of the softly approach that you mentioned there. There does seem to be some indication. I see the FT picking up on that this morning, that the rate for British tariffs will overall, one way or the other, be lower than it will be net for the EU. Now, obviously, it's for Keir Starmer, doesn't like playing the Brexit card, if you like, saying, oh, this is all because we got out of the EU or anything like that. But I think there is, if you like, being somewhere that is not at the front of the queue for getting hit by the big stick of tariffs will look a bit better for the UK. And I'm really interested in how that segues into the deal that you seem to think is pretty much there, but we don't know the details, but you think it's been done. And I'm interested in that. I didn't know that.
I think that the outline of the deal seems to be quite close. The problem is that because Donald Trump wanted his moment, he hasn't signed off, perhaps even to the surprise of some of those around him, and I think to the frustration of some of those in the UK. I don't think we would have got the noises out of government last week that we did unless it was really nearly there. That, although they were saying it wasn't done, there were reports all last week in the Times saying it would be done by Thursday, and that wasn't kicked out a touch by Downing Street and by others when you put it to them. And you can only get that close if most of the work has been done. Should we just, in the last couple of remaining moments, of course, all of this is going to splatter all over Prime Minister's questions, although in a sort of speculative fashion, because, at 12 o'clock today, we won't have any of the key facts.
Prime Minister's questions last before recess. We get to have a look at Keir Starmer and see how he's bearing up in practice. He's not coming in on a great day. I see Politico playbook this morning picking up on a More in Common poll, which showing a slump for Labour, that heading down towards 21%. Not great when you get towards the 20%. Always feels a bit like the third rail, doesn't it? It's one you don't want to touch in politics. But I think as much as anything else, we'll be looking at Keir Starmer to see, does he come across as robust? There's not much he can say. We don't have the detail, but does he look like someone who's bearing up in this crisis? And also, once we get those results, perhaps that is the moment when he will be able to, if you like, out-statesman all the challengers, and also perhaps put some of the doubts to bed about his own communications, because he's going to have a moment where all eyes are going to be on the Prime Minister to respond to Liberation Day, and probably not feeling it's the kind of freedom he most wants.
The challenge too is for the Tories and quite how they go into this. It's all very well for figures like Andrew Griffiths, the Shadow Business Secretary, who's shadowing Johnny Reynolds, who's been at the forefront of this negotiation, to call it the worst failure of trade policy for a generation. And whatever happens, he's right to point out real-world consequences for businesses and the public. But when you get into the substance of what they would do differently, they simply say it's the lack of transparency. It's the failure of Labour to set out their negotiating objectives. Well, nobody ever does that, and the Tories wouldn't have done that. And they also criticise the lack of getting in a room face-to-face with their US counterparts. Well, that's at the sort of weakest end of arguments. It doesn't really matter whether you're face-to-face, over a Zoom like we are, or what. So I'm not quite sure that the Tories are able to capitalise on this at this moment, but we'll see. In 60 seconds, shall we just do the big growth announcement by government? There has been a huge review into regulators and regulations that's holding back growth. This is a look into the blockers, particularly environmental blockers, that hold back our planning system. A Brown-era economist called Dan Corey has released his multi-hundred-page review. There are all sorts of changes proposed, like allowing developers to have one single regulator that they can go to that will handle all of their inquiries in future, rather than having to go to all sorts of different, green bodies like the Environment Agency and Natural Language. So there'll be one point of contact, and they are going to review the implementation of some nature rules. But here's the thing, Anne. This review, looking at basically the regulators and the regulations, has concluded that all the regulators which are there at the moment should stay. And most of the key regulations that are there at the moment, like the habitats and nature regulations, which are inherited from our time in the EU, should stay as well. They are looking at sort of reviewing some of the ways that those things are implemented. But this moment seems to push the responsibility for things not being built. Well, I guess if it's not the regulators and it's not the regulations, then sort of back on DEFRA itself, the institution, not the ministers. But it certainly doesn't feel like the big bang it could have been. So the question is, if it's not a big bang, is it going to make a great deal of difference? That's what sort of growth campaigners are asking this morning.
Well, we're just going to have to wait and see, aren't we, whether growth comes and how much that big trade bazooka hits it.
Now, there's one kind of growth that we don't like. It's growth of the length of this podcast. And oh my goodness, it looks as if it's expanding. So let's wrap it up there. Thank you very much indeed, Anne.
Well, I'm not going, length or not, without a Spandau Ballet lyric. And Sam, you are gold. Glad that you're bound to return. Something I could have learned. You're indestructible.
I am certainly bound to return, as are you, for Thursday's edition of Politics at Sam and Anne. See you in the morning.
See you then.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.